Hey guys, when it comes to our reveal trail cameras, we invest a lot of money and time into these cameras. And one of the best ways to get more out of your investment is to use your cameras throughout the rest of the year. Specifically, we're talking about spring scouting. First of all, it's really gonna depend on whether you're using used cameras or you're using new cameras. So we're gonna start with used cameras. You know, most of us hope that we take the time to go on ahead and clean our cameras out and prep them for storage at the end of the deer hunting season. The reality is the majority of us don't. So there's a few things that I like to do when it comes down to getting those used cameras ready for spring scouting. You know, it doesn't take much influence from the environment to cause some corrosion with your AA batteries or your lithium batteries over time, especially when those batteries have been in that compartment for an extended period of time. So I like to grab baking soda, a little water, and a little fine steel brush of some sort, or maybe a little bit of steel wool. And all you're trying to do is clean off those posts within your camera so that you don't have corrosion that could interfere with your batteries as you move forward. One of the other big things I like to do is clean out my SD card slot. And you can just use a little forced air, whether you're using the air compressor or one of your keyboard forced air bottles, just to blow dust and any debris out of that SD card slot. One of the next things is making sure that we go on ahead and check our seals on those cameras. You know, your cameras, especially in the spring, are going to experience moisture, whether it be extensive rains from spring showers or condensation. They're definitely going to face moisture. So you want to make sure that that camera is sealed off from the environment and from the elements. The last thing I like to do is just check any hinges on the cameras. Again, they can experience corrosion. So a little WD-40 or maybe something like some rim oil that you can spray on those metal hinges that will allow for those cameras to open and close a lot more efficiently and make those hinges last a lot longer. All right, guys, when it comes to best practices for new cameras, it really comes down to getting that camera out of the box and making sure that it's prepped, it works, that your cell coverage works all before you leave the house or leave your hunting shack. So let's just start from the beginning. Pull that camera out, get new batteries, check your batteries, make sure that they're good batteries that are full power. Beyond your batteries, what we're going to do is dig into going on ahead and going through that setup process of the camera, the activation process of your camera. So batteries are in, turn your reveal camera on, make sure that you're getting good signal out of your antenna, which is going to require the activation process that you're going to run through. Now, with reveal cams, you're going to use the reveal app to go through that activation process. It's a great time to go on ahead and test all of your technology that are within both the Gen X 2.0s and your X Pros, just to make sure that all the functions are working, making sure that it's cross-functioning with your app very easily, and that there aren't any noticeable hiccups before you get it out into the field. The last process that I like to do is, take a little time, whether it be of an afternoon or overnight. If you've got, domestic cats or dogs running around the house in the yard, going ahead and set up a little surveillance spot there with your reveal cameras. Let them run for the evening. Make sure that the camera is sending pictures back to your app, hopefully catching some of your critters running around the house. Make sure that your trigger settings are correct, your lighting settings are correct, and everything's like you want it. It's a lot easier to do that in the yard than it is in having to go back to your camera in the field. When it comes to setup of your camera in the field, there's 2 or 3 things that we like to focus on doing right out of the gate. One of which is making sure that we're matching our camera's capabilities with the kind of activity that we're trying to capture. Now in the spring, you're probably trying to capture one of 2 things, either turkey activity or you're trying to complete a deer survey on your local deer herd. So you need to think about the area in which you're placing your cameras and make sure that it's areas where you're going to capture that activity. If you're trying to capture your turkeys, your big tom turkeys strutting around in a strutting zone or a landing zone, don't place your camera in the middle of the timber. Go to those obvious places. It probably sounds a little obvious, but you'd be surprised how often the expectations of the person using the camera don't actually match where they're placing that camera. The other aspect of that initial setup is matching your camera's capabilities to the kind of activity that you're trying to capture. So what I would tell you there is that really kind of comes down to like a strutting zone for turkeys versus a travel corridor for deer. A strutting zone area, we know that we're going to be able to use slower trigger speeds because we're going to try to capture those turkeys moving around and staying in front of that camera for longer time periods. So we can use a slower trigger speed. Deer, on the other hand, traveling through a travel corridor from feed to bedding or bedding to feed, they're going to move through that area a lot quicker on you. So you're going to want to make sure that you have those faster trigger speeds teed up within the settings of your camera. You don't want to miss the opportunity to get the right picture or a lot of pictures. So now that we've identified our activity and our camera settings and matched our capabilities with both, you know, we're gonna start thinking about the way in which we're going to place the camera. And one of the first and most obvious things that I like to focus on is the direction of the camera. I like to avoid facing my camera in a southerly direction at all. And the reason for that is that the sun sits in the southern hemisphere in the spring. Which means that it can cause influence on the quality level of your photo and maybe even create some condensation within the camera if there happens to be any moisture inside with the heating and cooling of that unit as the sun warms it up daily. The other things that we like to be mindful of are water and vegetation. When it comes to water, you just need to make sure that your cameras are up out of the floodplain. We're a lot more susceptible to larger amounts of rain with spring thunderstorms in the early part of the year. And so you want to make sure that you're not in an area where that water level can rise above the height of your camera and potentially, you know, either damage or ruin your camera. When it comes to vegetation, this is probably the more important one of those two. And that's because when you first set out these spring cameras, everything's still pretty dormant and it's going to look like things are open. But what you need to think about is what's going to happen as those plants, those trees, those shrubs start to sprout or germinate and they grow into the area or into the view of your camera. This can cause the overuse of your camera, meaning activating photos that aren't, of course, animal photos and running down your batteries potentially. So try to be mindful of where that vegetation is. The other thing that I would really call out is one, making sure that your cell antenna is pointed in a good direction. Try to make sure that it's free of obstruction from a tree between the camera and a potential cell tower in the area, or just free of obstruction overall in one general direction. You want to try to make sure it's pointed in a great direction towards the open sky where it can transmit very nicely. The other aspect is just making sure that your picture's right. And what's really neat about the Reveal X Pro cameras is that you have the capability not only to use the screen on board on the camera as we talked about earlier, but you can also use the Reveal app to check that photo, making sure that you're capturing what you want to capture, where that camera is set up, and really optimizing your photo quality and your setup there in the field. So some best practices there for you that you can use as you're getting that camera set up in the field and ready to rock for spring scouting.